And this is the story of Jesus and the man who was born blind. So we're going to begin here in chapter 9. We'll read the first 7 verses. This is continuing really from where we left off last week. At the end of chapter 8, Jesus had been in the temple having those discussions with the Jews in the temple, and it had concluded with the Jews taking up stones to throw at him after Jesus had made that remarkable claim, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And they understood exactly what Jesus was claiming when he made that statement. And so they'd taken up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and he went out of the temple. So chapter 9, verse 1 continues on from there. We'll read down to verse 7 first of all. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from his birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be made manifest in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night comes when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." As he said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and anointed the man's eyes with the clay, saying to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. The healing of this man who had been blind from birth is the 6th sign or miracle that is recorded by John. And miracles of the giving of sight to the blind are found predominantly in the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus. There are no miracles of this kind that are recorded in the Old Testament. And outside of the Gospels and the ministry of Jesus, the only other occasion when blindness was healed was in the case of Saul in Acts chapter 9, when his sight was restored after 3 days of blindness, when he had had that vision of Christ on the road to Damascus. But in the Old Testament, it is God who is said to be the one who gives sight to the blind. We have some examples of this in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 11. This is when God is speaking to Moses at the burning bush and telling him to go back to Egypt to lead the people out. And Moses comes up with the excuses why he can't do that. He says he's not an eloquent speaker. I'm slow of speech and of tongue. And then in verse 11 of Exodus 4, the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him dumb or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" So the Lord indicating he's the one who's in control over those senses of sight and hearing and speech. Then in Psalm 146 and verse 8 as well. Psalm 146 and verse 8. Which says, "The Lord sets the prisoners free. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous." So in that list there, it is the Lord who opens the eyes of the blind. And in the Old Testament prophecy, the giving of sight to the blind is a characteristic of the Messiah's kingdom and the Messiah's ministry. We can see this in Isaiah chapter 29 and verse 18. Isaiah 29 verse 18 says, "In that day the deaf shall hear the words of a book, and out of their gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see." A couple more from Isaiah here. Isaiah chapter 35 and verse 5. "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a hart." And in Isaiah 42 and verse 7. "I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes of the blind to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. And Jesus in Luke chapter 4, verse 18, quoted from a passage in Isaiah chapter 61, when he read from the prophet Isaiah in the synagogue at Nazareth. And the words he read include this: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." So it was a subject of prophecy that the Messiah would give sight to the blind. So John records this case here of Jesus giving sight to the man who was born blind because of what it points to concerning the identity of Jesus as the Messiah, the light of the world. So verse 1 here begins this new section, and it's only in John's Gospel that we find this account of this healing of this man who was born blind. We're not told when or where this incident occurred, other than that we know Jesus is still in Jerusalem, or we don't really know the relation to the discussion of the previous chapter there. Did it happen immediately when Jesus left the temple, or is there some time gap involved there? But John simply introduces the story by saying that as Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. The disciples' knowledge of the man's condition led them to ask Jesus the question in verse 2, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" This is the first mention we have of the disciples since chapter 6. They weren't referred to in chapter 7 and 8 in those discussions taking place in the temple there. Whether they were there or not, we don't know, but they're back on the scene here, having been missing since chapter 6. So they asked this question, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" It was commonly believed amongst the Jews that any kind of sickness, a disease, or any experience of disaster was due to sin. One of the rabbis said, "There is no death without sin, and there is no suffering without iniquity." And this was the argument that Job's friends made when they were trying to account for the suffering that Job was going through. They were telling him, "Well, you must have committed lots of sins, otherwise you wouldn't be suffering in this way." Jesus also alludes to this belief in Luke chapter 13 in verses 2 to 5. There's an incident referred to here. Verse 1 says there, Luke chapter 13, "There were some present at that very time who told him of the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices." He's referring to some Galileans who Pilate had put to death. And Jesus answered them, "Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered thus?" So that's the implication there is, well, they must have sinned, otherwise they wouldn't have suffered in that way. And Jesus goes on to say, "No, unless you repent, you will all likewise perish." And then he refers to another disastrous incident. "Or those 18 upon whom the tower in Siloam fell and killed them, do you think they were worse offenders than all the others who dwelt in Jerusalem? I tell you, no, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish." So again, there we see how people would explain disasters like that. A tower falls down and some people get killed, and people think, well, they must have been bad sinners for that to have happened in that way. And this is the background to the disciples' question here concerning this man who's been born blind. So whilst the disciples seem to accept this position, that someone must have sinned, the case of a man who's blind from birth presents a particular problem. So could his blindness be caused by sins that he had committed before his birth? Some of the rabbis said it was possible for a baby to sin in the womb, or could his blindness be due to the sins of his parents? And if that's the case, well, how could that be considered fair? Why should the baby suffer because of sins of the parents? So the disciples look at this man and they see a theological problem. So they want to discuss his condition in terms of who sinned that he has been blind from his birth. But Jesus discounts both suggestions made by the disciples. Jesus says it was not that this man sinned or his parents. So Jesus detaches the man's blindness from anyone's sin. So his suffering is not the result of sin, either his own sin or the sins of his parents. And Jesus continues in verse 3 by saying, but that the works of God might be made manifest in him. So the man's blindness serves a purpose. It will enable the works of God to be shown or manifest in him. Jesus says in verse 4, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night comes when no one can work. Jesus includes his disciples here when he says we must work the works of him who sent me. So that they are included in this ministry as well. And these works of God must be done whilst there is the opportunity to do them. The coming of night will prevent these works from being done. So the opportunity is not always going to be there. To Jesus, then, the blind man was not a theological problem to be discussed, but he was an opportunity to do the works of God. The disciples had looked at the man and they'd asked, how did he get this way? Who was responsible? But Jesus looked at him and he asked, what can we do to help him? The opportunity to help him will exist as long as Jesus is in the world, for he says in verse 5 that he is the light of the world. And this suggests that Jesus is aware that his time on this earth is limited. He's not always going to be there in the flesh to do these sorts of works, and therefore they must work urgently while they have the opportunity to do so. Jesus' claim to be the light of the world was first made back in chapter 8 and verse 12, and now he repeats it again here. And it will be demonstrated in the healing that follows. So giving sight to a man born blind is a sign of Jesus' ability to give spiritual light to the world. So the miracle then will be an object lesson on spiritual conversion. So the blind man's physical need is a symbol of the spiritual need that exists for all people. Verses 6 and 7 describe very briefly how the healing was carried out. Jesus spat on the ground and he made clay with the spittle, and then he anointed the man's eyes with this mixture. The man was then told to go and wash in the pool of Siloam, and on doing this he came back able to see. Jesus, of course, did not need to do any of this. He could have just spoken the word and the man would have received his sight there and then. But it seems Jesus wanted to involve the man himself in the process. And so he instructs him to go away and wash in the pool. The use of spit or saliva in healing is seen in some other occasions in Mark chapter 7, verse 33. This concerns a man who is deaf and unable to speak. Verse 33 says, taking him aside from the multitude privately, he, that's Jesus, put his fingers into his ears and he spat and touched his tongue. And then in chapter 8, verse 23 of Mark's Gospel, another story of the healing of a blind man here at Bethsaida. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. When he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands upon him, he asked him, do you see anything? So at least on 2 other occasions, Jesus had spat in order to facilitate or bring about a healing. In the ancient world, it was thought that saliva had some healing properties within it. So perhaps Jesus could have been using the methods that were accepted in his day in order to encourage the man's faith. So having anointed the man's eyes with this clay that he'd made from the saliva, Jesus then told him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And this would be a test of the man's willingness to obey what Jesus is telling him to do. John explains here that the name Siloam means sent. There might be some significance in that Jesus is sending him there, and that Jesus is the one who has been sent into the world. The water that was in the pool of Siloam, it wasn't a natural spring at the pool, but the water came into the pool from a spring, the Gihon spring, which was outside of the city, and it came in through a tunnel that King Hezekiah had built from the spring to fill up this pool inside the city, so that in times of siege, Jerusalem would have its own supply of water. That would be a great engineering achievement, because the tunnel was cut through solid rock. 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 20 tells us about this tunnel. And two groups of workers worked from opposite ends, and they met in the middle. And in 1880, an inscription was discovered which commemorated this achievement when they completed that tunnel, much like the Channel Tunnel, which was built from the French side and the English side, and they met in the middle under the channel as well. So on obeying Jesus' instructions, then this man went to the pool, he washed, and he came back seeing. And the miracle itself is recorded in a very restrained manner. We're simply told that he went and came back seeing. We'll read on here verses 8 to 12. We have here the reaction of the man's neighbours when he comes back. The neighbours and those who had seen him before as a beggar said, "Is not this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." He said, "I am the man." They said to him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." It must have been a wonderful thing for this man to come back able to see. He's never seen anything before. He's been blind from his birth. But now he can see colours, he can see people, he can see faces, he can see houses and the sun, the sky and the clouds. And the effect of the healing upon the man's neighbours and those who saw him begging is now recorded. And this is the first mention of him being a beggar, although being blind would make it difficult for him to do anything other than beg. And people had known him as this blind beggar. Probably he was a well-known character in the local community. And they're now amazed that he can see, and they're asking that amongst themselves, "Is not this the man who used to sit and beg?" And the opinions were divided over him. Some were saying, "It is he," but others said, "No, but he is like him." So they thought he just looked like this man who they knew as a blind beggar. So there was something familiar about him, but there was also something different. And the man himself put an end to their discussion by saying, "I am the man," so confirming his identity. So their natural question now is, then how were your eyes opened? He's been blind from birth, but now he can see. And so they all want to know, well, how did this happen? And the man's answer is brief and to the point. He says, "The man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." This man doesn't know very much about Jesus other than his name. He refers to him as the man called Jesus had done this. So the people then ask where Jesus is, but the man doesn't know. Jesus is not around anymore. We'll read on now to see what happens next in verses 13 to 17. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. The Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" There was a division among them. So they again said to the blind man, "What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?" He said, he is a prophet. The man's now brought to the Pharisees. There's no indication here of how long after his healing that this occurs. Was it straight away? Was it sometime later? Was it another day even? And there's no indication of who they are who brought him to the Pharisees. It could be referring to the neighbors of the previous verses. But why would they want to take him to the Pharisees? There may have been some question over the identity of the man and the genuineness of his cure. And it might have been felt that as the religious leaders, the Pharisees, would be able to verify his cure, or at least that they would have some opinion on this. They'd have something to say about it. In verse 14, John now explains that it was the Sabbath day when Jesus had made the clay and opened the man's eyes. And this has a bearing on the discussion which now follows. And this is the first time that we've been told that this happened on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees asked how the man received his sight. And the man gives the same answer that he gave to his neighbors in verse 11, but even more concisely now. He says, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Just three simple points. He put clay on my eyes, I washed, and now I see. The man's answer was a cause of division now amongst the Pharisees. Some said, this man, referring to Jesus, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. According to this group, Jesus had broken the Sabbath, and therefore he could not be from God. And they would say that he broke the Sabbath in three ways. First, by making the clay, which making the clay from the spittle would be regarded as kneading, as you would knead dough, and that was work, so that wasn't allowed. And then second, he broke the Sabbath by healing. You could only give medical attention on the Sabbath if life was in danger, and then only enough attention to stabilize a person's condition. And that wasn't the case with this man. And then again, by putting the spittle on the man's eyelids, that would also be regarded as work. So they saw Jesus then as a lawbreaker, and therefore he could not be from God. But there was another opinion amongst them. Some asked, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? This group looked first at the sign or the miracles that Jesus performed, and they concluded that he would not be able to do these things if he were a sinner. So the one event produces two different reactions amongst the Pharisees here. And since they cannot agree amongst themselves, they now ask the man his opinion. What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes? And the man answers without hesitation, he is a prophet. The man had had just a brief encounter with Jesus. He didn't seem to know very much about him. In verse 11, he had referred to him as the man called Jesus. But now, reflecting upon what has happened, he goes further and he calls him a prophet. And at this point, this is as much as the man can say or think about the identity of Jesus. So the investigation continues now by the man's parents being called in for questioning, in verses 18 to 23. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight, until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked him, is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself. His parents said this because they feared the Jews. The Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess him to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, he is of age, ask him. The Jews clearly do not want to believe that a miracle has occurred here. Their minds on this have already been made up. In their minds, Jesus is not from God. He's a lawbreaker. He could not have performed this miracle. And they do not want to believe that this man was born blind. And so if they can establish this, then the whole event will be exposed as a fraud. And so they now called in the man's parents to hear what they have to say about this. And they asked the parents two questions. Is this your son who you say was born blind? So they want the parents to confirm his identity and his condition. And their second question is, how then does he now see? Perhaps in asking the second question, they're inadvertently admitting that he was blind and he now sees. How does he now see? The parents are cautious in their response. They can answer the first question. They say, yes, he is our son, and yes, he was born blind. But they will not commit themselves on the second question. How he now sees, we do not know, they say, nor do we know who opened his eyes. So they want the Jews to redirect the question to their son. They say, ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself. So he's old enough to speak for himself. They do not want to get involved in this matter. They sense danger here, and so they're very careful not to speculate or even to express an opinion about how their son can now see. And John explains here that the reason why the parents are reluctant to answer, they were afraid because the Jews had agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, they would be put out of the synagogue. So there's an atmosphere of fear here. Being put out of the synagogue was a threat used by the authorities against the followers of Jesus. We see later in chapter 12 and verse 42 that same threat is mentioned here. John says, nevertheless, many even of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, lest they should be put out of the synagogues. And then also in chapter 16, verse 2, Jesus warned his disciples that this would happen. They would be put out of the synagogue. They will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God. There was this atmosphere of fear that had been created by the Jewish leaders, and we see that again back in chapter 7, verse 13. Where Jesus is about to go up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, we're told there, yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. Later on in chapter 19, verse 38, we're told this, after this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave. And then in chapter 20, verse 19, on the evening of that day, that's the day of Jesus' resurrection, the first day of the week, the doors being shut where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them. So there was fear. The Jews had created this atmosphere of fear amongst the people, that they were afraid to talk about Jesus, to discuss who he might be. Being put out of the synagogue was a sort of excommunication from the Jewish community, and it would have serious consequences for the person involved. It meant exclusion from every aspect of Jewish life, exclusion from the community, being shunned by your own community. And so it is this threat that makes the man's parents afraid to say anything about how their son might have received his sight. And so the man is now questioned again. The Jews turn back to him for the second time. Verse 24 to 34 says this, so for the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. They said to him, What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you too want to become his disciples? And they reviled him, saying, You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. The man answered, Why, this is a marvel. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshipper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out. So the Jews now turn back to question the man for a second time, and they say to him, Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. Give God the praise can be understood in two ways. It can mean tell the truth. It's used that way in Joshua chapter 7, verse 19. So it's as if they're putting him on oath. They suggest that he's holding something back. And so tell the truth, put him on oath. Or it can mean give God the glory because he's the one who really worked this miracle. So don't give praise to Jesus. He's a sinner. Give God the glory for this. The response of the man here shows his courage and his confidence, that he's not to be intimidated by the authorities. He will not be bullied by them. He says, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. So he's not going to get into any discussion with them over whether Jesus is a sinner or not. He said, I don't know anything about that. But the one thing he does know, the one thing he is sure of, is that he was blind, but now he sees. And nothing they say can change that fact. So the Jews don't really know where to go from here, but they're still determined to cast doubt upon the miracle and what it says about Jesus. So they persist in their questioning and they ask, What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And again, the man shows that he's not to be intimidated. He reminds them that they've already asked him this and he's already answered that in verse 50. So what's the point in him telling them again? And then with great boldness, he asks them, Do you too want to become his disciples? Now he's mocking them with this question. He knows that they're so opposed to Jesus, they would never become his disciples. So he's not afraid then to provoke them with this question. And his question perhaps implies that he now includes himself as a disciple of Jesus. Do you too, you also, implying that he is one, want to become his disciple? And the question then, it exposes the true character of these men, that instead of rational argument, they now turned to abuse. They reviled him and they compared themselves with him. You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. So they adopt this attitude of superiority and show their contempt of Jesus. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. And here's the irony of this, that they claim to be disciples of Moses. Well, if they were disciples of Moses, they would have believed in who Jesus was. Back in chapter 5, verse 46, Jesus had said to a similar crowd here, if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. So Jesus claiming there that Moses had written about him. So if they're claiming to be, well, we're disciples of Moses, well, listen to what Moses said, and you will come to the conclusion that Moses had spoken about Jesus. Well, the man shows his skill now at answering their argument and establishing his own. We can see him growing in confidence here. In verses 30 to 33, his argument here, you say you don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know God does not listen to sinners, but only to those who worship him and do his will. Never have the eyes of a blind man been opened before. If Jesus were not from God, he would not be able to do anything. The Jews had said that they did not know where Jesus came from. But the man's argument is that Jesus must be from God, otherwise he would not have been able to open his eyes. God would not listen to someone who was a sinner, but God had listened to Jesus. So the evidence of the miracle then points to the fact that Jesus must be from God. And the man is amazed that the Jews cannot understand this. But the man's logic and reasoning carries no weight with them. They're not convinced, and they treat him with contempt. You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? No, they're not going to be taught by an ex-blind beggar. Who does he think he is, trying to teach us? And John then says, and they cast him out, probably means that they put him out of the synagogue, as they threatened to do to those who believed in Jesus. Well, reading on here in verses 35 to 38, we read, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who speaks to you. He said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard this, and they said to him, are we also blind? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt, but now that you say we see, your guilt remains. John records the compassion of Jesus here for this man who's suffered this for his sake. Jesus somehow heard that the man had been cast out, and he went to find him. And on finding the man, Jesus' question to him was, do you believe in the Son of Man? By the question, Jesus is trying to assess where this man is, what is his faith like? And the man's answer reveals his willingness to believe. He says, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? This is the first time that he has seen Jesus. When the man left Jesus to follow his instruction to wash in the pool of Siloam, he was still blind. And when he came back, Jesus wasn't around anymore. The man addresses Jesus here as Sir or Lord. She's using it as a term of respect, because he doesn't yet know who Jesus really is. But Jesus then reveals his identity to the man. He says, you have seen him, and it is he who speaks to you. So Jesus identifies himself as the Son of Man. Do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? You have seen him, and it is he who speaks to you. And the man's response then clearly shows that he understood what Jesus was saying. Lord, I believe. He uses the same word that he used earlier addressing Jesus, where it's translated as Sir or Lord. But now he's no longer using it simply as a title of respect, but rather to acknowledge his belief that Jesus is the Son of Man, that he is Lord. And the man has now arrived at really the fullest and most complete understanding of who Jesus is. He began by referring to him as the man called Jesus. Before the Pharisees, he declared him to be a prophet. Later, he acknowledged him as a man who had come from God. But now he understands him to be the Son of Man, the Messiah, the object of his faith. And in an act which shows just how much he understood about Jesus, he now worships him, that Jesus is Lord. Jesus then makes a statement which sums up really what has happened in this whole chapter. He says, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind." The result of Jesus coming into the world is that blind men see, whilst those who have sight become blind. There's a sort of reversal that takes place. So the healing of the man who was born blind illustrates this principle, that those who are spiritually blind and who recognize their blindness can come to Jesus and they can receive sight from him. But those who think that they can see without Jesus are the ones who turn out to be blind. Now, some of the Pharisees who happened to be nearby heard these words, and they asked Jesus, "Are we also blind?" Their question expects a negative reply. With all of their Bible knowledge and the lives that they try to live, well, how could they possibly be blind? We can't be blind, surely. But Jesus' answer is to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains." If the Pharisees were blind, they would have no guilt. Their problem, though, is that they claim to be able to see. They claim to have spiritual knowledge and insight and understanding, but they are guilty because they have this knowledge and they're acting against it. And if their actions were consistent with their knowledge, then they would have believed in Jesus. They would have believed in who he really was. So this is really a remarkable chapter, a remarkable story that we have of this this man who was born blind, and it's an illustration really of how Jesus is able to bring light into this world of darkness. It's that spiritual light that we find when we come to Jesus. A few questions to think about from the chapter here. Can you identify the stages in the growth of the blind man's faith? What are those stages that he goes through? How would you describe the character of the blind man? How do you understand the relationship between sin and suffering? That was what the disciples wanted to talk about at the beginning there. And why did Jesus make clay, anoint the man's eyes, and send him away to wash rather than heal him immediately? And how did the Pharisees display their own blindness? So a few things to think about there, and we'll leave the questions up there. And if anyone has any comments on the questions, or if you have any different questions or comments you'd like to make, then please feel free to do so.